Well, good evening to you all, and welcome to the second Durham Castle Lecture. I would like to start by doing something I think that is rarely done, but we should do. That is to begin by warmly welcoming, not all of you, but particularly welcoming, of course, our speaker. And I suggest we join together in congratulating him for his new appointment, which is pretty stupendous. So let's do it. It's, of course, a hugely important role, and I can imagine few people better suited to than the current Bishop of Durham. Justin heard of his appointment, according to The Guardian, while rushing to a meeting. And let me quote what The Guardian has him saying. "I was chasing off to something last Friday, and the phone went, and I muttered something rude about phones and answered it. And the Prime Minister's appointment secretary said, 'The PM is writing to you to offer you the See of Canterbury.'" Pause. The article goes on then to quote Justin again, quote, "My initial response was, oh no. I was overwhelmed and surprised." The first I heard of his appointment as the new Archbishop was while watching Godfather 3. Of course, it's about the other church, but it paints a rather daunting picture of the intermingling of faith, power, interest, struggle, and conflict. And no doubt Justin is very familiar with this world of pure reflection and deliberation, and we wish you very well as you find your way through it. It is always said that Justin went to that quite good school, Eton, and then went to that quite good university, Cambridge. But what you really need to know is that he went to that outstanding university, Durham, where he studied theology between 1989 and 1992 and trained for the priesthood. Justin is well known for having spent 11 years in the oil industry prior to his training as a priest. This rich management background became invaluable in later positions in the church, and particularly as Bishop of Durham, where he has done an exemplary job in mixing faith, spiritual leadership with a new level of good management. We are filming this lecture this evening for our own purposes, and will make this available on the internet in due course. May I ask out of courtesy that there's no other filming of the event tonight, no flash photography, both during the lecture and the question and answer session that will follow. And in addition, of course, please turn off your mobile phones or put them on silent. We will take questions at the end of the evening on the content of the lecture. Hope that's clear enough, on the content of the lecture. So having said all that, please join with me in giving him again a very warm welcome.
There's a series of bits of bad news at the beginning of this lecture. First of all, I lost my watch this morning, and so I don't know if this one's still working, so I won't be able to tell how long I've been speaking for. So if it goes on...
As soon as you come back.
I think that's really just unfair. Thank you. It's a great honor to be here, and a great privilege to be here. And let me say that at the beginning of this lecture, that since I was very kindly invited to come here some 6 months ago, a number of things have happened. My own personal position and potential employment has changed somewhat, despite my best endeavors to the contrary. The latter is of more concern than the former, my potential employment. One of a group of advisors that I have now acquired said to me as a parting shot after a press conference last Friday, which attracted some attention, "You need to realize now that every word you say will be scrutinized." So for the benefit of anyone taking notes who might be publishing it later, when I'm making a joke, I shall wave a hand. Tony Blair warns in his book that it's very unwise to use irony. It's unfortunately my favourite form of humour. You lot needn't laugh. They need to notice. As I sat down to write this lecture, having been mulling it over for a while and looking at a number of different aspects, the temptation grew to play it safe and give you my well-known substitute for a deep general anaesthetic, a lengthy lecture on arcane passages in the Old Testament concerned with rock badgers and why we should not eat camels. It's Leviticus 11, if you're interested. Alternatively, I could have told a series of semi-humorous stories and sat down with a reputation as an equally poor after-dinner speaker as I am a philosopher and theologian. But while I intend to be a little cautious, I do feel that too much caution is a serious error in itself. So I will try to think of the consequences and then forget them. My aim is not a magisterial review of the literature, ideas, and potential developments in the area of faith and religion, but to raise some issues and make some suggestions. I am, in effect, thinking aloud, and with more experience may well change my mind entirely. So be warned. In 2005, the now Chief Justice of the United States, John Roberts, was appointed under the presidency of George W. Bush. As in most cases of Supreme Court nominations in the present very polarized state of US politics, there was a good deal of toing and froing at his confirmation hearings. One of the key questions was around the fact that Chief Justice Roberts is a Roman Catholic. I remember the extraordinary impression it made on me when I saw, while on a trip to the USA, to Washington, during the nomination process, a comment from a US senator to the effect that provided his religion had no impression on his conduct, it should not be a problem. Let me just repeat that. Provided his religion had no effect on his conduct, it should not be a problem. The same happened a couple of years ago with a potential European commissioner, an Italian, who stood down, again Roman Catholic, and is happening today with another. And those stories are, of course, only a particularly clear example of the issue that I want to talk about tonight. To anyone who thinks about that senator's comment, the idea of religion being so privatized that it has no impact on one's conduct is so palpably absurd that it is extraordinary that it could be said and not be held down with hysterical laughter. But it was not. On the contrary, it was seen as serious comment. I started with the story about Roberts because it reflects a general view in many areas of political and social discourse, that a religious worldview disqualifies one from holding any serious political opinions or any political opinions that should be taken seriously. To take another example, not by my colleagues on the Parliamentary Banking Standards Commission, the other commissioners, but by various people that we've interviewed in the last few months in Parliament on the conduct and standards of banking, and those are our terms of reference. It is perfectly acceptable for me as a bishop to talk about derivatives trading, but I have to tread rather more carefully when speaking of ethics in banking. It's quite ironic, really. The reverse used to be the case. Bishops were expected to know nothing about anything practical, but at least to be able to pontificate at some length, albeit with little effect, about ethics. I want to suggest this evening, by the way, that was irony. I want to suggest this evening that for our society to flourish, it is necessary for us to grapple with equal respect with a wide range of opinions, regardless within reason of their origin and basis. There is nothing new about this, and I want to be clear that I'm not claiming any authoritative rights in any area, even where I believe that what is said has divine authority, and much as I regret the days when I could have laid down the law, but simply a right to be able to persuade. I want to start with the change from religion as truth to religion as lifestyle. The change from religion as truth to religion as lifestyle is well documented, and the arguments about the sources of the move are clearly established. One of the key aspects of change is the result, I believe, of largely improved communications, which means that we're aware of the diversity of equally strongly held views, each of which provides a framework for living and a set of underlying values within a given culture. One of the problems with the issue of sexuality across not only the Anglican Communion, but equally in other churches, is that cultural tradition sets frameworks ensuring that what is seen as a human right in one area is unacceptable sin that threatens societal structures in another. It's not a new problem, let's be clear about it. It's just one that as power centers, great imperial power centers have diminished, has become harder to deal with, and as we've become more aware of the diversity, has become harder to deal with. In the 1830s and 1840s, as the British Indian Empire consolidated its grip on northern India, William Henry Sleeman was appointed to head a campaign against what the British called thuggee, which was the ritual killing of travellers by worshippers of Kali, or to be accurate, that was what the British perceived it as. I won't go into the more complicated details. In a notable lack of interfaith dialogue, Lord William Bentinck, the governor of Bengal, when reproached by an Indian ruler that thuggee was part of the tradition, replied that one of the British traditions was to take people who'd been involved in thuggee and blow them from the mouths of cannons. So there is nothing new about the clash of cultures. It's just that the balance of power has changed. And the effect of the web and telecommunications, as well as large-scale immigration, has, as we all know very well, led to a much wider exposure to a variety of faiths, and thus inevitably to a sense of questioning of the truth of any. It is predictable that as a result, faith has moved from a matter of authority and therefore worthy of something that could contribute to political discussion, deriving from sacred texts and long-standing tradition, to lifestyle, a way of occupying time instead of other forms of leisure. One of my better memories of the oil industry was my boss saying to me at one point, when he asked what I was doing one weekend and I said I was going on a church weekend, he said, it's fascinating the different hobbies people have in this company. Graham Mather, he said, talking about one of my colleagues, runs a tram museum, and you have religion. It becomes a form of leisure. If one accepts this view, and I don't, then as Bishop of Durham, I am at the moment essentially the manager of a dispersed range of ancient leisure centres. I'll soon have an international dimension. It's a hugely important change. It affects the way we understand issues of truth and authority in a most profound way that we often ignore. A second aspect of the change away from religion as truth has been the perceived decline of religion in the face of the challenges of science, of philosophy, of suffering and war, and above all, in our recent era, of materialism, and of our growing confidence in human capacity to manage all the invisible threats that in the past were thought to be the province of God or the gods. People have less respect for something that is perceived to be going downhill, both intellectually and in any other ways. It doesn't matter whether it's a football team, a trade union movement, or religious practice. The fall in Church of England attendance from roughly 3.5 million in the 1930s, perhaps rather more than 8% of the population of England, not Britain, of England at the time, to roughly 1 million out of a little more than 50 million now, 2% as opposed to 8%, thus a drop of 3/4, is in effect a reversing of Elijah's experience with the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel. And I do wish the iPad would not correct my spelling of profits with a PH to profits with an F, which I've just noticed. When the text comes out, that will need adjustment. If you remember, those of you who are doubtless deeply familiar with the texts of the Old Testament will remember that Elijah challenged the prophets of Baal to demonstrate who was God. By God would set fire to a sacrifice on an altar without human intervention. Jehovah won. When the prophets of Baal failed, the people of Israel then turned to Jehovah, and the prophets of Baal were slaughtered. In my long experience of choral evensong at cathedrals, this has always provided entertainment for the boy choristers. Decline in practice and devotion matters. It is a sign of loss of intellectual, emotional, and spiritual grip by Christian faith on the hearts and minds of those who follow it. That is why one of the things in this diocese that we've begun to look more and more carefully about is the importance of numerical growth. We've said this quite openly. Things that are going downhill carry less weight. That's not a physics point, by the way. But decline, the inevitability of decline is a false assumption. In recent months, research led from Cranmer Hall in St John's College here, Durham once more leading the field, has demonstrated that the church in England has grown rapidly in certain areas, and not only in the suburban Bible belt around London. But overall church decline is a feature of Northwest Europe to a far greater extent than elsewhere in the world where there is a Christian tradition. And so, we move from truth to leisure. A third reason for changed attitude towards truth claims based on religious worldviews is a reaction to oppressive behavior justified on the grounds of any religious faith. And this I hate as much as anyone else. In this context, religious practice is perceived as indicating that religion is like a virus. When it is in the bloodstream of a society, it causes some people to behave impossibly badly. And finally, religion as truth is not trusted as much as it was, if at all, because of a sense that mystical reasons for anything may provide entertainment, personal satisfaction and motivation, or some sort of escape from worries, but cannot in any sense be thought of as being the basis for the organization of rules about how society should function. So we have seen a move from religion as truth to religion as leisure. And that has a profound impact on the relationship between politics and faith, and the capacity of faith to have an impact in the world of politics. Anecdotally, as I understand it, though nobody's told me in so many words, one of the reasons I was put on the Banking Standards Commission was a throwaway, ironic comment in the House of Lords that I'd once traded in derivatives. I mean, spent some time trading in derivatives. I got into the habit. It wasn't I just did it once. And there was this sort of rustle around the House when I said this, and the next thing I knew, I was investigating banks. Worries me a little about how these decisions are taken. So, if religion is no longer authoritative, what else might it be? Edward Gibbon, in The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, in Volume 1, Chapter 2, wrote that the various modes of worship that prevailed in the Roman world were all considered by the people as equally true, by the philosophers as equally false, and by the magistrates as equally useful. Some things never change. In the past 10 years, we have seen much effort by governments in all parts of the world to conscript faith groups of various kinds, whether here or overseas, into useful roles contributing to society. Our charity law has recently changed so that religion has to demonstrate a socially useful purpose in order to be considered as charitable. That would have been incomprehensible 100 years ago. It was a given. But this change has some very good reasons. Religions provide very extensive and effective networks. In much of my work in sub-Saharan Africa over the last 10 years, in areas of serious civil conflict, the only systematic networks that have continued to function throughout the civil wars have often been the churches, especially the bishop-led churches, linked as they are by parishes through to deaneries, through to archdeaconries, to dioceses, and then to provinces. It's a system that has survived the end of the Roman Empire, on which it was based, the Dark Ages, and endless wars that have disrupted all other forms of government. In Sierra Leone, during the Civil War, the church in Freetown with its bishop was able to reach across boundaries and borders and front lines. In the Democratic Republic of the Congo, in the east around Goma and Bukavu, the church continues to function. I was speaking to a friend of mine there yesterday, ever more efficiently with the use of mobile telephony as a provider of intelligence and information of what is going on, in support of refugees, in protection of the huge proportion of women being raped by the marauding militias. It is the area of the greatest gender-based violence on earth, by a long way, and as a peacemaker and reconciler. A friend of mine who is a vicar in Goma, Anglican, when I interviewed him once at Liverpool Cathedral and asked him, at the height of the civil war in eastern Congo, when one of his own children had been killed, how many refugees did he have in his parish? He paused for a moment because he was speaking his fourth language when he was speaking English and said 2 million. 2 million. That is a very effective kind of network. Secondly, faith groups often have a sufficiently strong moral compass at the basis of their operations to reduce the corruption that is endemic in many parts of the world and is made worse by violent conflict. They provide high levels of social capital. Members of UK churches give approximately 22 million hours of voluntary service outside the church every month. And all of that is a significant saving to the state. It's done at low cost, and it's no wonder it's seen as useful. And thirdly, the church and other faith-based groups provide extremely effective NGOs. One of my most powerful experiences in some ways at Coventry Cathedral when I was running its international mediation side was being invited to join a considerable number of consortia bidding to win contracts from the Department for International Development for conflict management and mitigation projects around the world. It was extremely striking that the sums that the winning consortia demanded by way of fee and remuneration dwarfed the amounts of money that we were used to handling as an NGO in a faith-based organization, the church. For us, a project costing £100,000 a year was a lot. For DFID, it was too small to be worth considering. In the last few weeks, I received an appeal from the primate of the Anglican Church in Sudan concerning the need to assist certain refugee groups. He was asking for the massive sum of £4,250. 3 years ago, I sent £5,000 from Coventry to support a priest working with the refugees in Goma. I received back a detailed account, including signatures of receipt or crosses or thumb marks for every single penny that we sent. This is good use of funds, and where that happens, faith-based groups can be seen as useful. But utility is not the same as effectiveness. I like being useful, but I do not like only being useful. And the church is not there only to be useful. And yet that is a trap into which we often fall, into which I have continually fallen. Faith, if merely useful, has no role for worship except as a means to an end. The comfort and hope that Christ brings becomes no more than a moral prop, not a strength. It is a fatal corrosion of what we stand for when we are useful and no more. And that brings me to my third main category. I want to argue for faith not only as truth, but also as a source of flourishing. The clash of truths without means of progress remains one of our most challenging intellectual and political problems, most famously set out in MacIntyre's After Virtue as regards our own culture in the early 1980s. Yet post-World War II civil conflict management experience has demonstrated the common underlying assumptions of ultimate purpose provide powerful means for conflict transformation. Over the last 10 years, my work has always included some element of interfaith dialogue, usually where faith is seen as an excuse for powerful people seeking financial advantage or political advantage by motivating and mobilizing those whom they wish to use as their tools with the use of faith. In the great riots in Kaduna in northern Nigeria in 2000 and 2002, and in Jos in September 2001, we saw this very clearly. Essentially, those problems were based around youth unemployment running at about 80%, around ethnic difference, and around economic failure and market failure across the whole economy in the area. But that makes a very poor political slogan. It is hard to motivate a militia by explaining to them that they and their families are suffering because they're the marginalized victims of an economically unfair, globalized trade system, which is compounded by the after effects of colonialism and imperial misrule and misdrawing of borders at the Congress of Berlin in the 1880s. You've lost them sometime before that. But if you say Christians good, Muslims bad, or vice versa, it's pretty simple. It's not true, but it's a hook that works extremely well. And if you use the hook for long enough, it becomes a reality. And that was what was happening. And yet, despite the use of faith, we discovered that as we began to work with the different groups there and the faith leaders, we could use the sense that both Islam and Christianity had a deep, if deeply differing, sense of ultimate purpose as a framework in which to argue about the issues that were dividing the society. Religion, having been used as a hook for destruction, was able to be used as a hook for reconciliation. The clashes could be held far more effectively in a non-violent context through discussions amongst faith leaders than any other way. The same was true in Burundi in 2004, and the whole concept of reconciliation, as opposed to merely ceasefire or temporary halts to hostilities, is one that is based fundamentally in a Christian worldview. Reconciliation is seen as a virtue because it springs from God's action in Christ towards the world. Reconciliation is in fact the process by which diversity is transformed from destructive to creative difference. It is not about agreement, but about how to disagree and yet flourish. And our society is extremely bad at handling disagreement. Some techniques we've developed and work very well. A general election, a presidential election, is essentially non-violent civil war, where the hunger for power is kept within acceptable boundaries. But the absence of means of dealing with large-scale ethical and moral issues, whether around sexuality and marriage, end of life or its beginning, or the rights of those caught up in war and terrorism as perpetrators, all these appear to end up being decided on the basis of the majority as win-lose alternatives. Too often, religious groups, churches, find themselves drawn into the same way of dealing with these issues, which are essentially secularized means of conflict resolution, seeking majorities, persuading ourselves of the wrongness of the enemy and all other unacceptable forms of demonization that are so prevalent in armed conflict. We do not use the alternative means of finding an acceptable form of diversity. but finding acceptable forms of diversity is what enables human flourishing. There is not one single way of dealing with these issues in a society where people are coming from many cultures and many different approaches. Creating a safe space in which to hold these differences while we arrive at conclusions as to how to move forward is one of the most difficult and challenging areas that face us today. The religious worldview provides a context, arguably among others, in which the clash of truths can be handled safely. Secondly, fair competition for truth provides no threat, but in fact offers opportunities for growth. I've always been and remain strongly against laws around blasphemy, feeling that since we are not a theocracy, whatever I might wish for in the depths of the night, by the way, that is a joke, it should, didn't go very well, did it? But it's a joke, hey. It should be open to people to disagree very strongly and express powerful views without fear of prosecution. I work in a dungeon. Genuinely at the moment, my office is being dealt with at the castle, at Auckland Castle, 11 miles from here. And the only alternative place they could find for me to work is the dungeon. So that's where I sit. It gives me food for thought, because for many centuries, the bishops of Durham used to put people in there for disagreeing with them. I'm a traditionalist. Those of my clergy here might like to listen carefully to that point. But we have moved on from there. I want to be able to argue that Christianity presents the truth about the world and God's relation to the world, and thus about how we ought to live in a way that has a burning core of truth not duplicated elsewhere. I'm perfectly happy for someone to contradict me and to claim that they have the truth and I'm deeply mistaken. I've had this discussion at gunpoint, which may not have been quite as happy a situation as being here, but since neither of us persuaded the other and I am still here, can be construed now as a perfectly acceptable form of diversity. A Christian worldview, in this case, insists both on love for one another and love for those with whom one differs, and treating others with respect and gentleness. And it seems again to provide a basis for human flourishing that is difficult to find in an atmosphere of either legal protection of views or where there is an absence of respect for faith-based rationality, or even the rejection that there could be such a thing as faith-based rationality. Thirdly, a religious worldview merits being treated seriously, at least because for many centuries it has provided a coherent social narrative about why we are here and what the aims of our society can be. Thus, I have yet to find a structure of social teaching equal to that developed by the Roman Catholic Church since Leo XIII's encyclical of 1895, Rerum Novarum, and continued at intervals by virtually every pope since, especially John Paul II and Benedict XVI. In his last encyclical, Benedict XVI talked about the merits and virtue of acts of gratuity as being necessary to life within an economic society. He was challenging most fundamentally there the whole idea that human value and dignity can be measured merely through economics. And in his presentation holds together powerfully the ideas of subsidiarity, solidarity, the universal destination of goods, and the common good, without these values being merely the property of one political party or ideology. It is a narrative based in the Christian narrative which gives us tools with which to engage with the challenges of the injustices of our society, both nationally and internationally. Fourthly, faith-based worldviews provide a prophetic challenge which prevents the overwhelming sense of groupthink, which is the biggest menace to our society, as we've seen over the last 10 years. With very few exceptions, the establishment view in economics has been for many years that growth was a good in itself, that since the banks and the financial structures services industry produced growth, they must be good, and thus it was dangerous to challenge them. This was not only a view on the right, it is important to say, but one that covered virtually the entire range of mainstream politics and within the church, and it was one that at some points I held. The major challenges to it, both within the financial services industry and outside, came from faith groups, including especially the Roman Catholic Church, as it cut across their understanding of the narrative of human dignity and worth. Dismissing all views that are based on faith simply because of that fact removes this prophetic challenge. And finally, I want to argue that diversity is a good in itself. I don't think this is especially controversial, and I won't labor the point. It is seen in the natural world, and it is in the variety of gifts and abilities and interests that we have around us. It is seen especially in a university like this, with its diversity of disciplines that possibly spend most of their time simply ignoring each other, but in this university, there is a strong attempt to try and bring them into interaction, not because so that they can all come to the same point of view, but so that the diversity produces a response, a reaction, which leads to greater wisdom and learning. Diversity enables growth, reflection, discomfort, and thus the process of a true dialectic within our society and within our church. I'm not denying that there is such a thing as truth, on the contrary. But I prefer to live in a society where different truth claims, all seeking to be seen as absolute, are permitted and indeed encouraged and listened to and respected, than in one where to question and to argue is seen as betrayal, prejudice, or phobic of one kind or another. I am confident as a Christian, in part because I believe Christian faith to be rational to the degrees that it is meant to be, in part because of experience of the reality of the presence of God in Christ, and in part because I have seen its impact in changing and transforming situations of absolute despair and providing a basis and framework for reconciliation, springing from the reconciliation of humanity to God in Christ. That is why I believe in evangelism, which is not to be the same as an evangelical, by the way, though the two words are often mixed. It's why I will argue for all kinds of positions that other people will find intolerable. I don't mind being told I'm wrong. I think it is absurd when I am told that I cannot be right because I start with Christian belief. Thank you very much.
Well, Justin is happy to take questions now. My preferred mode is to do 3 at a time. The great advantage to you is that you don't have to answer all of them, and you can pretend to lose sight of one. So let's take them in clusters. There's a roaming mic somewhere. If you just put up your hands, it would be nice if you just say who you are and be very succinct. Thank you. So, first question. Here on
reminded me by mentioning evangelism at the end about a famous evangelist called J. John, who described his reaction at great Christian speeches and oration. The 2 words that came into his mind, he used to say, was, "But how?" So that's my question. In order to establish an acknowledgement that you can, in public, start with a voice of faith from our current position you've outlined, which marginalizes that, how?
Thank you. Can I take another question? Come on, audience. Very good. Question here.
Peter Garvey, I'm a curate in Sunderland, and my question is a very simple one. It's, Justin, would you advise me to a typical undergraduate, say graduating from this university very soon, going into the professional workplace, who is a Christian, following your first comment at the start of what you said, how should they
Let's take one more. There's a question towards the back. Thank you.
Nick Berber, I'm a student here. You said diversity is good, but to what extent do you think diversity is important or should be encouraged within the context of the church itself?
Okay, thank you very much. That's 3, so you got about 2 or 3 minutes to get the next round of questions together. So, Justin, in the meantime.
Thank you. Yes, I've heard J. John say that many times. I think the but how is around how we structure our society. I think that the French concept of laïcité, of a secularization of the structures of society, of an attempt to shut out entirely the religious sphere from the political sphere, is one that has great peril in its sense that it prevents the use of views or the declaration of views that do not fall within that fairly narrow framework. And so I would argue that where it is acceptable, that the presence in our schools, our hospitals, our prisons, in the army, in the armed services, in Parliament, of a religious worldview on an institutionalized basis provides not privilege, but the opportunity to say that life is more complicated than we think. And therefore, that's a valuable thing. And that going for a privatized and purely personalized form of faith by law is very dangerous. Secondly, how advise the new graduate going into business? Well, it's what I did. I think what I would say is make sure your disciplines of faith are clear from whichever tradition you come from. And in terms of your public declaration of faith, always listen before, I mean, it's just very practical advice, listen before you speak and be gentle and calm. Don't fight battles that you don't have to fight. That is probably one of our biggest series of mistakes. I think my own experience at that point is of remembering that I spent most of my time putting my foot in my mouth and shooting myself in the foot at the same time. It's very dangerous. Thirdly, diversity within the church. Why do I sense an elephant trap in that question, Nick? I think, yes, I do believe in diversity within the church passionately. Because there is diversity within people, and the church, as someone was reminding me during our meal a little while ago, that my predecessor here, Tom Wright, used to say that since there is enormous diversity within the world around us, and that the people who are living around us are often in the church, we will find the same levels of diversity, disagreement, and problem. The difference ought to be that in the church we manage those differences in love and without enmity or seeking to crush them out of existence. And that's where, realistically, I don't think anybody would sensibly deny we have, well, put it charitably, not always succeeded.
Yes, great. Mic over here. Oh, very good. Here we go. Can you bring the mic down? Thank you.
I'm James Woodward, I'm a philosopher. I have some sympathy for your opening remarks about the idea that religion could be seen, or faith seen as a sense of equatorial with leisure as being absolutely absurd. I think it is. But I wonder, for me, I think Jung's analysis of humans is correct in that we are religious beings. We cannot not be religious. For me, it's not a matter whether we are we observe it or not. It's a matter of how that worship takes place. And I wonder, in terms of a problem being materialism, but not economically, but philosophically. So we end up with shopping malls being places of worship, or the idea that there being anything other than a material world seems absurd, so that on that basis it can be there. So I'm not sure that it's just marginalised as leisure per se, but a sort of broader malaise. But we are all religious. I would also say, I agree, I think atheism is a form of religion on that basis.
Thank you. Yeah, mic over to this side, other way, Patrick. Just over there.
Yes, I'm a middle common room student at this college. When I was very much younger, we had a concept that was called good corporate citizenship in the businesses in which I was involved. That led me to consider the exchanges that you're reported to have had in the Lords Committee over the last few days, which made me feel, and appeared to make you feel, that the distance between good corporate citizenship and what is actually happening in certain business or industrial sectors is lacking. Therefore, that causes me to press you again that first question on how to achieve a change in the way in which you anticipate change to be made.
Thank you. There's a question at the back. The left. We'll come back to you in a moment. Right at the back.
Hello, I'm Josh. I'm a student here. Your earlier remarks, you said that there was an instance of somebody of whom it was said that as long as their religious views did not affect their behaviour and their kind of position and their voice would be fine. I guess my question is the motivation for saying that to some extent is the protection of people from those who would seek to use their voice to harm others and to incite others to anger. To what extent, if the government wants to kind of limit the voice of the church maybe, to what extent is it right to want to institute that protection? To what extent is it stepping over the bounds of freedom of speech?
Okay, those are very clear questions. I'll add one more, if I may, just abuse my position as chair for a moment, which is you place a lot of emphasis on reconciliation, and you have a great deal of experience in many African countries of reconciliation as a process. So I'd like to ask you, based on that experience, when and under what conditions has reconciliation failed, and why?
Right. Do you mind if I stand up?
Yeah, please do. It's better.
Thank you. Nice, easy questions. I attracted a certain amount of notoriety last week, which got me in I could really say good morning and get in the papers at the moment. It'll wear off, hopefully. But I did last week by remarking carelessly to a journalist when he was asking about the betting on whether I'd become, whether I would be nominated as Archbishop, reminding him that I was, generally speaking, not a horse. I am, generally speaking, not Rowan Williams. And to my great misfortune, I have to say, and his learning would do very well on some of these questions, which mine slightly struggles with. I agree with the point that about, I mean, yes, I agree with the fundamental point about religion, about us all having a religious spirit in some sense. But I think for it to be true, you have to redefine religious spirit in a way that broadens it to a point where it becomes almost meaningless. Because once you include it as a sort of sense of shopping malls as worship, I think you've run into some problems about how one understands religion. But the fundamental point, the Jungian point, I agree with entirely. Good corporate citizenship. This arose out of an exchange I had with Stephen Heston yesterday at the Banking Standards Commission which I think is what you're referring to, which was reported this morning, in which I asked him what, he's the head of Royal Bank of Scotland, and has done a very remarkable job in turning that bank round, I hasten to say. But I asked him what he thought the social utility of the bank was, what was its social vision. And his answer was in terms, he used the phrase, good corporate citizenship. And I was pressing him, as you pressed me, for something slightly more penetrating than that, which I described as motherhood and apple pie, which was probably inappropriate language, actually, in reflection. But I wanted to push him to say, what's the bank for? And I was hoping for answers, I suppose, around developing thoughts, if we're going to see changes in banking standards, around developing thoughts of solidarity, of access to finance, of enabling regeneration and that kind of thing. And our disagreement was because he wasn't prepared to be pushed. How do we achieve change? I mean, I do have a great respect for him, I need to say, and it didn't come out in the reports. How do we achieve change, particularly in the financial services industry? I think change will come in a number of ways. I think the most obvious is around alterations to the structures of our financial services companies. One of the big problems Paul Volcker made, and this comes back to what we've been talking about this evening, when he gave, the former chairman of the Federal Reserve, when he gave evidence about a month ago, was he spoke of the clash of cultures between the investment banking transactional culture, in which your client was essentially someone from whom to make money, and the relational culture that was meant to have existed with some of the commercial banks in the past, which didn't have investment banking arms. And his solution to that was what's called the Volcker rule, and splitting the two apart and enabling a relational culture to develop. I think the redevelopment of a sense of probably enforced through supervision and regulation, of a sense of duty to the client is one of the key things that will make a big difference to the culture of the organization. And as Gillian Tett in the Financial Times about 3 weeks ago pointed out, there have been cycles in this over the last 100 years at least 3 times, and that's worth remembering. Limiting freedom of speech. This is one, I suppose, is the heart of what I'm saying. Much as it does result in absolutely horrendous and foul and revolting views being put forward by some people some of the time, I find the American approach to First Amendment rights really quite compelling, because they basically set very, very broad limits to freedom of speech, and they see the limiting of freedom of speech as something that is in itself deeply harmful to the nature of society, and more harmful than allowing things to be said with which we profoundly disagree. I think that the experience, the history of the church is of constantly seeking to limit freedom of speech until more recently, and of any group that acquires power of doing the same thing. And it's one of the major concerns I have in trends that we face at the moment, that certain forms of speech may be hateful, but is it wise to make them illegal? Because once that weapon is deployed in one direction, it is as easily deployed in any others. And as I understand my history and the writing of the US Constitution, the Bill of Rights, that was one of the key reasons for the Founding Fathers putting those elements in. And why has reconciliation failed? Well, I suppose there's a cheap, easy answer, because people didn't want it to succeed. I think reconciliation, and this is a massive challenge for the church, which is founded on the concept of reconciliation, has underlying it the sense of the reshaping of the person, in your own eyes, the reshaping of the person you're dealing with. What do you see them? What shape do you see them as? Do you see them as demonic, other, to be hated, or do you see them as someone of intrinsic, infinite value with whom you bitterly and profoundly disagree? And that is a transformation that is enormously difficult to bring about and enormously challenging to individuals. I remember being in Burundi, facilitating a meeting between rebel and government leaders towards the end of the civil war there, military and civilian. And we went on for 3 days. The first 2 days were quite polite, and the third day was extremely impolite to everyone. And in the middle of the third day, one of the crucial points, we were just by Lake Tanganyika, one of the crucial points was someone stood up and said, pointed across the room, and said, that man over there led a militia that is responsible for 30,000 deaths. 30,000. I mean, it's such an enormous number of people, including the speaker's family. How can I ever be reconciled to him? And at the time, I answered in terms of the alternatives. What's the alternative? Is you have to go on killing each other till there's only one person left standing. But what has happened there was a societal desire to move away from the killing of about 7% of the population over the previous 10 years. And reconciliation there began to make progress, though it's by no means achieved, because of a change of will, a recognition that there was almost no alternative, and thus a looking for means of reversing demonization. Where it's failed, which it, to answer your question, it does more often than it succeeds. The UN 2000 said 55% of Syria's civil conflicts since 1945 had restarted within 5 years of cessation. So 45% didn't. So it fails more often than it succeeds. Where it's failed, it's, I think, been because the issues have been dealt with as the presenting issues, the political issues, the economic issues, but not the underlying issues of demonization and hatred of the other, the spiritual, the metaphysical issues. I'm in your hands.
Oh, that's it. We'll be here for a while then. Yes. Where's the mic gone? Yeah, let's take it to the back and then come down.
I'm a student here, and I would like to take this opportunity to ask a question about religion and science rather than religion and politics. If we take a look at the history of Europe, it's very interesting to see that there is a severe suppression against science and scientists. Take the Italy's Galileo Galilei's example. And also in the history, there are great scientists like Newton in the Christian world. So my question is, what's the relationship between religion and science? Are they contradictory with each other, or they can promote each other? And with the development of science, is there a possibility that religion might disappear? Thank you.
Modest challenge. All right. I can move here. If you stay at the back, Patrick, I'll just take the mic here.
Lydia Khan. My question is around numeracy, and you mentioned the declining numbers in the church, and I just came from a lovely but very sparsely populated evening song this evening over in the cathedral. And I'm wondering if there's potential, as you step forward, to work with relationship and to work with developing intrinsic and deep relationship between people's core essence and the church in a very different way from right or wrong or shouldn't.
Andrew Miller, I'm a lecturer here. You've given a lot of examples of reconciliation, but they all seem to be based abroad. And I wonder what role you felt this sort of religious approach to reconciliation might have within our own society?
Okay. We'll come back for one more round, I think, after these questions. But let me toss in another one for myself before you get up. I thought what you said about reconciliation was, very convincing. The drift of your argument, at least one of the drifts of the argument, is about the almost impossibility of the separation of faith and politics. Because if you have faith, to disembody faith from yourself and engagement with politics is almost asking you to do something impossible. And they're also saying that faith and the clash of faiths bring different truths to bear as lenses on politics. And if they don't bring a truth, they bring at least a diversity of perspectives which illuminate the range of possible considerations of justice and so on. Yet, we have recently had examples of faith-based politics which the appeal to faith and ready concepts of good and evil have actually, arguably, had something of a destructive or simplifying role in global politics. What I have in mind is the position that both George Bush and Tony Blair had in common in seeing the world and being able to divide the world into good and evil, a sort of simple polarity, as it were, of faith, using faith as a model for distinguishing in-groups and out-groups, good from the less good, and using that as partly a way of understanding foreign policy, conflicts in foreign policy, and so on. I just wonder how you reconcile, on the one hand, the desire, the willingness, the necessity of faith-based people and authoritative faith-based figures such as yourself to engage in politics on the one hand, and yet, on the other hand, must be aware that those who claim, as it were, monopolies of certain faith-based views can readily, as it were, polarize the world in a way that is distinctively unproductive.
You did say that I could forget to answer some questions, didn't you? Religion and science, this is really seriously not my sphere of knowledge in any way at all. So I'm going to be very, very careful here. The engagement I've had in this area has always convinced me, no, religion and science are not necessarily opposed. They are simply talking about the understanding of the nature of ends in different ways. I'm looking at a physicist down here to see if he's nodding or shaking his head, but that has been my understanding. And because of that, because I believe in God, I don't think religion will disappear. That doesn't worry me at all. I've never thought that would happen. I mean, we've talked about human beings as religious beings anyway, but I just think God's bigger than that. But it's really not an area that I think I should talk about at any length, because I would be just sharing my ignorance even more than normal. Reconciliation in our own society, it's a very good question, I think a very, very fair question. Yes, I've done quite a lot of that, particularly working with a friend of mine in London who's been setting up community reconciliation and mediation work in some of the more deprived areas of the country, in doing the same thing across parts of Liverpool and across parts of Coventry. I think the reasons I was using foreign examples is that it gets me away from issues of breaching confidence rather more easily, and I'm always quite careful about using things that are too close to home and where people or areas can be identified. I think the same principles have applied, issues of demonization, particularly between police and youth, and particularly between people who've lived in an area for a long time and young people, particularly unemployed young people in that area, often leads to issues of severe community conflict, which require reconciliation and a change of view of the other, rather than merely preventative hard measures. As well, it's both and. I think the I've missed one question. I can't read my notes and I can't remember the question. Developing relation. What was that one about? Do you remember? It was the one after science. I'm so sorry. It was the second one. Oh, it's Lydia. Oh, yes, yes, got it. Got it, Lydia. Thank you. Yes, I think the boundaries of Christian belief are tolerably broad. And one of our dangers is for our own security is we bring them in and in and in. And so we start operating on basis of inclusion and exclusion rather than on the basis, above all, of relationship with God and also of relationship with one another, which springs from our relationship with God. If you look at patterns of some of the more interesting churches in the New Testament, like, for instance, the church in Corinth, it was a church of wild diversity and profound internal division, which gave the material for 2 of Paul's letters, but has at its heart the issue of how people relate to each other. It has it within it, rich and poor, different views over Christian doctrine, the most fundamental Christian doctrines, and different views over morality, including sexual morality and the nature of marriage. And within that, you see a church that is struggling with the complexities of relationship. To put it in crude language or simple language, the problem with the church is it's, and I've said this before, is it's a home for sinners, not a refuge for saints from the world. And if you put lots of sinners in one place, you just get lots of sin. They don't all become saints because they walk through the church door any more than people become saints when they're ordained. And so I think at the heart of it, that's why I'm so keen on issues around worship and prayer, because I think that is transformational of the nature of our relationship with God and with one another, and therefore with one another. Faith-based politics, yes, absolutely. I want to question the assumption that they are faith-based politics, in part. I think I go back to my Nigerian example and say that very often the intertwining of political views, of concerns about power balance, and of issues of faith is so complex that we just take one strand out and identify it because it's easy to do. I think we also, speaking as someone whose first love was history and first degree was in that area, we need to recognize the complexity of events and that the partial or total ignorance that applies. And that when we look back at, I mean, you're presumably referring particularly to the Iraq War. When does, I'll just repeat it for those at the back, when does faith-based politics become destructive because it's dominated either by a single truth or a single set of truths which condition the approach of the politics? I think my answer to that is when it becomes powerful. I think one of the things I suppose I want to say is I don't worry about the church's weakness, because the pattern of Jesus ended his ministry with extreme weakness, redeemed by the grace and power of God. We are meant to be, says he who's about to move into Lambeth Palace, with the poor. Yeah, I know, I laughed too. You could have laughed less loudly. No, don't be sorry. It's something that we have to think about. I think the church is at its worst when it holds on to power rather than when it acts with compelling love. Now that's a truism, so I'll try and be clearer. The church is at its worst when it seeks to exercise power rather than demonstrating the transforming impact of God's love in our own lives and in how we treat others. I was in a church in Sunderland last Saturday where there was a food distribution centre going on, and they were preparing for winter shelters. It's one of the main Sunderland churches. It's not a powerful church, has a relatively small congregation. They're growing quite rapidly. And yet it was just enthralling and gripping. And I could see why the church was growing, because of its engagement in love and the transformation that brings, rather than its engagement in power. It was seeking to serve and facilitate. And the vast majority of the Church of England, of other churches, that's how it works. That's why I said last Friday that the front line is the parishes, because that's on the whole what they're doing. And it's when we start calling down our rights rather than our service that we begin to lose the plot, I think.
I think that's probably a very good place to end, unless some of you have a really urgent question, and we could have a very quick round of final questions if you really think it's urgent. So where's the mic? Let's take a few final reflections and then give you an opportunity perhaps just to sum up rather than to address them one by one, since I think we were at a very fine point just then to end on. But let's just do brief, keep it now very brief, please.
I just wondered, given the diversity the great diversity that you suggested within the church, there is doubt about the extent to which religious leaders can be said to be representative of the views of the religion and the religious group that they lead. And on that basis, in a democracy, I wondered why religious leaders should have a privileged platform on which to speak if they lack the necessary representation of their constituency.
We'll hold that one. Okay, I'll take a question at the front quickly, and then you could work your way back, Patrick.
Ruth Gladhill from The Times. When the Bishop was referring to limits on the freedom of speech and opposing them, I did wonder if he would be prepared to share with us his views on Leveson and the possible outcome.
Since I said right at the beginning we'll only take questions on topics raised in the lecture, well, a lot of topics arose in the lecture, but I didn't think that was one of them, but I leave it, of course, to the Bishop. Let's just take a few more as we go down and keep them very short, and then we'll give Justin an opportunity to pull his talk together.
I work here at the university. In terms of the issue of decline, which you flagged up right at the beginning, some 60 years ago, the jazz musician Miles Davis launched his famous album, The Birth of the Cool. And ever since then, this elusive, indefinable quality of coolness seems to have dominated sort of media, image-conscious age. And since then, organisations or people or groups who seem to epitomise this elusive quality of coolness seem to prosper. They're attractive, they're powerful, they're engaging. We could argue they were, Apple Corporation, Greenpeace, whatever, Obama possibly, Amnesty International. Would you want Christianity in the Welby age of Anglicanism to be cool? Or do you see that as a false god?
Okay, let's take a question at the back over there on the seats.
Torsten Frost in Scotland. You've been talking about the role of Christianity within politics, but what do you think about when different main world religions meet in one political system? Can they mix?
And let's take one final question from the back. We have to draw a line somewhere tonight, and this is it.
Sam Wiley from Newcastle. Thank you for your talk and thank you for making time given your recent appointment. My question is, as you say, freedom of religion is really important, but do you think that nowadays people aren't actually hearing those truth claims clearly? Do you think that Christians in the public space need to be doing more to speak clearly about the good news of Jesus Christ, graciously and lovingly?
Ruth, I'm very sorry, I'm not going to answer your question. But at least I'll tell you I'm not going to answer it. I was thinking of an answer, but I just saw too many holes in it. Religious leadership, I think this comes back to the issue of cool or whatever, of different faiths mixing within the same political space and so on. I think religious leadership is not, is very far from unaccountable. That's a double negative, I hate double negatives, is very accountable. We're accountable in the way that people respond to what is said. The Archbishop of Canterbury assures me, as he's known in the trade, 104 assures me, he's the 104th, that he has no power at all. He merely has some influence. I suspect that's probably entirely true. I certainly know as Bishop of Durham, I have very, very little power. I can't force clergy to do something. I can't force them to say something. And I certainly can't force them to shut up. Sometimes I want to. Usually I don't. I think, therefore, I just think the question misses the nature of religious community, which is about leadership through consent and recognition, not by votes in ballot boxes. It's not saying that that's a universal model that should be followed. It's just saying that's, in many of our churches, that's how it's done. And when that consent breaks down, it becomes very evident and people leave. In terms of coolness, is religion going to be cool in the Welby age of Anglicanism? I entirely doubt it. There's never been any sign. I've never been accused of that in my life. And the dangers are little now. I think, coming back to what I've been trying to say and trying to sum up together, I want the church, it is right that the church, I think the church needs to be confident in declaring its faith with gentleness and respect and love. And Christians need to be clear about their faith. We need to do God. And it's very easy not to. And what makes for a flourishing church is one, as I've tried to say, that holds within it diversity and enables difference within love. And what makes for a church that is contributing and enabling society to flourish is that it shows how this can be done and facilitates its doing in the wider world. And where I've seen that, and where there is a passion for worship and prayer and the encounter with Christ in silence and in noise, in those situations I've seen hugely flourishing churches, and it's something that I'm utterly confident and optimistic about for the future. not because of any great leadership, because of all the people that could have been chosen for this next job. I have to say, as I've said in public before, I did not see myself as one of them. But God is bigger, as I said last Friday in the press conference. God is bigger than all the things we can each individually or collectively get wrong. And I think at the heart of it is that the church ought to be able to have its voice heard with no privilege, but neither with disadvantage. Thank you.